I want to welcome you anyway to the Álamos History Association meeting. We're glad that you came out because we love to have a good audience here. And we're really happy with our YouTube presence because we're getting 50 or more people watching online, which is great. But it's not the same for a presenter as when you're here. So we thank you very much for coming out. First of all, our president, Pam Price, will give a welcome, and then she can introduce Susan and we'll start the meeting. So Pam Price.
Okay, I'm sorry not to be here with you today. I'm still recovering from a serious bout of influenza and pneumonia and have to conserve my energy, but I'm really looking forward to Susan's presentation today about the fate of Jews and their forced conversion in Spain and their migration to New Spain. And this is another really interesting topic brought to you by the Álamos History Association. So please take it away, Susan.
Thank you. And if you don't know Susan, she and Mike are from Tucson, have a house in La Capilla, just a couple of minutes from our house. So Susan, you can begin. And everybody mute.
Yeah. Good morning and welcome, everybody. As Earl already explained, as Earl mentioned, we were talking last year and I mentioned the word Conversos. And he said to me, oh, what does that mean? So I explained that this is the word used for people who were Jewish, who were forced to convert in Spain. And he thought that that subject would be very interesting to the history group. Obviously it is, since this is a bigger audience than I mostly see. So I said I would do a presentation and then started looking up. This was what I was hoping against, material. And I was absolutely so surprised to see how much came up. Unfortunately, I could not find anything related to Álamos. But I do highly recommend one source that I used, which is called Internet Archive. It's online, and they have digitized a huge number of documents and etc. There's all kinds of stuff. And it's free, although they do ask for donations sometimes. You can see everything from plays, videos, theater, just all kinds of material. So that's in the bibliography that I have, and I couldn't recommend it more. The use of the terminology is something always up for discussion. The word conversos is more modern than what I grew up with. The term when I was growing up was called marranos, and that is a derogatory connotation because it really means swine. And there's lots of controversy about the etymology of that phrase. They were always also called crypto-Jews, new Christians, Judaizantes, and I don't know whether there are other words, but those are the ones that I've commonly found. There's also the word Morisco, which refers to the Muslims who were forced to convert. And I'll go into some of the history of how that came about. There are two groups of Jews, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi. Iberia was referred to as Sepharad by Jewish inhabitants. And there's supposed to be a map of Iberia. It was just to give people an idea of the area where this all happened. And probably a lot of you know what Spain and Portugal look like, but I did have that map. This is a map of the area called Iberia, which of course includes Portugal as well as Spain. And what I found out, which was pretty amazing, was that the first recorded persecution of the Jews was in 489 CE. Jews used the word common era rather than AD, and for earlier, they don't use BC, they use BCE, before the common era. And then the persecutions continued periodically after that date. So crypto-Jews began to observe in secret, figuring that they better stay well hidden. In 711, the Muslims came into Iberia and they ruled from that time. And this was a comparative period of tolerance called the convivencia. Jewish art, music, medicine flourished. There were scholars and rabbinical academies. Maimonides was born in Cordoba in 1089. He was a famous physician who codified Jewish law and wrote philosophical work entitled Guide for the Perplexed, which maybe would be useful today, I don't know. So that was just to give an example of what the period was like and how much the Jews were accepted at that time. As far as the music, they say that Las Mañanitas is an example of Sephardic musical origin. Jews followed many hygienic practices that were not generally followed by the population. And this seemed to give some protection from the plague. As a result, they were rumored to be responsible for it. Of course, they were also rumored to carry out many rites that were complete fabrications. Of course, Catholics were not happy with the situation when the Muslims ruled, and they united to regain control, which finally was accomplished in the Reconquista. Jews by then had been confined to ghettos and had to wear badges to identify themselves. As a result, many converted to Christianity by the end of the 15th century. The Edict of Expulsion in 1492 stated that all Jews must leave the country by the end of the century or face the Inquisition. One source even says that the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to marry a Portuguese king, but only on condition that all Jews were purged or converted. I was unable to pin down more information about this, so I don't know if it was just a theory. When the edict came out, most Jews went to Portugal, and they were there until the Inquisition followed them there several years later. The Inquisition continued for 350 years. There are not accurate numbers of how many left or converted or were persecuted, but they were in the hundreds of thousands. And I'm going to leave out any graphic description of how they were treated by the Inquisition. And many were accused only by hearsay. So a great number left Portugal for other European countries or the New World. There were large numbers in France. Bordeaux alone had 7 synagogues. And then others went to Bayonne, which is pretty close to Bordeaux. In Italy, there were large settlements in Ancona, Ferrara, Venice, and Livorno. In parts of Turkey, they still speak Castilian. There's some speculation that Columbus may have been a Marrano, and at least one of his crew, Luis de Torres, knew Hebrew, and he was taken along because they thought they were going to end up in the Middle East. They didn't get that far. Many important people at court helped, and many of those had Jewish roots. So Jews were included from the first days of colonization of the New World. Cortes was accompanied by Hernando Alonso, who was Marrano, when he came to Mexico City. Next map.
Yes.
This is a map of the Viceroyalty, the area that was New Spain and ruled by the Spanish king. When Coronado went to what is now the southwest in 1540, he was accompanied by his wife, Beatriz de Estrada, who was a converso. Juan de Oñate, whose name is probably familiar to most of you, was the first governor. He was descended from conversos on his mother's side, from the chief rabbi of Burgos in Spain. His name was Salomon Halevi. Many Jews became important in the church, while conversos became important in the church, and Halevi was no exception. He became Pablo de Santa Maria and was bishop of Burgos. So it went from chief rabbi to bishop. Although he was said to be authentically converted, there were many others who were only outwardly so. Somewhere in mid-15th century, there was something called the Sentencia Estatuto, I think it's, that applied what they called limpieza de sangre in order to hold public office. That meant that people had to prove their true Christian roots. Like many others, conversos had high positions in church and government, which they thought would provide cover to prove their ties to Christianity. And then Oñate's expedition claimed all kingdoms and provinces of what is now New Mexico in the name of the king. When conversos came to Mexico, they became involved in expansion of the mining sector and also agriculture, stock raising, textile manufacturing, and all levels of commerce. And we have a couple maps from that time. The first is the mining area. So they began to go north as they discovered that there was ample mining activity available. And the next one is the Camino Real. It just shows the Camino all the way up where you see Santa Fe. And then the next one should be the expeditions with Oñate, and there were other people who also.
Maybe I don't
Well,
know.
anyway, they went north and claimed the land. Now back to what was going on earlier. By 1571, the Inquisition became a formal tribunal in Mexico. But as the economy boomed, as they were going up to these mining areas and people were getting very wealthy, the Inquisition kind of lost interest in persecuting them. And so when that happened, many more people came from Iberia to settle in the area. In Mexico in the mid-16th century, Jews practiced in secret, but at that time they still knew the religious rites. Later, their knowledge became very vague. they practiced things that they didn't quite understand. By 1671, there were settlements in Puebla, Oaxaca, Veracruz, Guadalajara, Querétaro, Pachuca, and Tasco. Some claim there is a connection to Miguel Hidalgo, a leader in the fight for independence, who was accused of heresy and practicing secret Judaism. There was scarcely a region in New Spain without Conversos. Mexico City became the focal point. The families there were close-knit. There were extended family relationships. They were educated and literate. The largest family was Simón Valles Sevilla, who was wealthy and powerful, with far-reaching commercial interests, and he was also into finance and lending. Oddly enough, the Jewish quarter was in close proximity to the palace of the Inquisition, and there could be a map of the Jewish quarter. They were in a very concentrated area in Mexico City. Anyway, it shows maps of several streets, and they're very close together, and they were right downtown, and the palace of the Inquisition was right there. It was mostly women who maintained the faith because they did a lot of things in the home, but there were also secret synagogues too. The Day of Atonement and Passover were observed, but they were rarely understood. It was not unusual to finish all work by Friday night, often bathing and changing linens, lighting candles for the Sabbath. And it was interesting to me, on a side note, one of the people who was accused of being Jewish, even though she wasn't Converso, was accused by her maid, who said, well, she changes her linens on Friday and she takes a bath. And so the poor woman, she said, I take a bath other days of the week too. But she was accused, so they didn't have much interest in investigating what was really true or not. Funeral rites such as washing the body, turning the face to the wall, burying within 24 hours in a simple shroud, serving boiled eggs when people came back to the house, was a symbol that life still goes on despite death. Sitting Shiva, which is 7 days of mourning when people gather in the home and usually do little remembrances about the person who died, and giving charity. They believed in the unity of God, not the Trinity, and circumcision as a covenant with God. Different slaughtering practices, no pork or shellfish, and not mixing milk products and meat are examples of some of the observances. Much of the research on settlement in Mexico and later New Mexico is from a book by Stanley Hortis, who was the New Mexico state historian. There's extensive information and a treasure trove of very detailed footnotes. He said that much of it was hard to research since the people involved were always trying hard to avoid detection. They also often took names common in Spain as more of a cover, so it's really hard to know certain names. The names that are common in Spain often are also Jewish names, but you can't go just by that since they wanted to hide, so that was a cover. But there was a name such as de la Calle, which was the term used for the ghetto, la calle. Solis, Oñate, those did indicate Jewish roots. There was a family called Avendaños, who were Jewish families in Spain and Portugal. One married into the family of a Juan Lopez Holguin, but I did not receive any response from the historian here who has that same last name. Unfortunately, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 destroyed a lot of the documents. In general, most people apparently were not concerned with Jewish practices unless it was useful against political rivals. This is a theme that repeats in most of the countries. Rivalries were extensive as different groups fought to gain or return to power. In 1846, the US invaded the territory and half of it was ceded to the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 gave American citizenship and freedom of religion, but many still practiced in secret. You never know when it's going to be a problem. There were many who became Protestants in order to gain access to the Bible. Catholics had priests as intermediaries to interpret the Bible for the people. In the 20th century, less and less was passed down to later generations, but many customs remained, although they were still poorly understood. Many people were told cryptically of some Jewish past, but that was often thought to be just imagined by their grandparents. World War II and the rise of anti-Semitism led some Conversos to maintain their secrecy. However, things like mezuzahs, which are scrolls placed in doorways, were found in hidden places. We do have a picture of mezuzah to give you some idea.
Those are the graves.
That's a mezuzah. Inside is a little scroll with text from the Bible. And the tradition is that you put it in the doorway of your house. And most Orthodox Jews always touch it and bless it as they go into the house. There were many who had different naming patterns outside the house and biblical names inside. Here is a quote from a book called The Coffee Trader. Although it is fiction, the sentiment is accurate. Who would you be today, I ask you, judge me harshly, if your own name was a secret whose revelation could cost your life and the lives of your friends and family? That's about Jews who went to Amsterdam when they escaped from Spain. Some social scientists have developed 4 criteria to try to determine identification as conversos. 1 was self-identification, 2 was Jewish practices, 3, tracing the actual genealogy, and 4, acceptance of Jewish beliefs. There is, however, one researcher who has posited that since the culture was dominated by an Anglo ruling class, claiming one who has Jewish racial origins makes Hispanics more white, in quotes. I'm not sure about that, but it's all there in the history. Some research done in cemeteries has found 6 pointed stars, Hebrew writing, 7 branched candelabra, and stones placed at the grave to denote that someone is still thinking of the deceased. You'll see a Star of David in Hebrew writing on this one. There should be a couple other. There's one where someone did a very, very evident cross so that it would look like a Christian grave. But you can see very pale underneath the arms of the cross are etched really tiny 8-branch candelabra. I don't know how they don't show real well on here, but This was an attempt to make it look like more of a Christian. This is one that has the stone on it. When we go to the cemetery, it's customary to leave a stone there. And I think the indication is that someone has been there remembering the person. Interviews with contemporary conversos indicate that they felt divided personalities, and one even said she could not say anything against Catholics or Protestants in her own family, since many of them do not recognize their Jewish heritage. There is a rare autoimmune disease called pemphigus vulgaris, known as PV, that is mainly carried among Jews. They've now found that Hispanos in New Mexico also carry it to some degree more than in other Latin countries. Another genetic mutation is carried by Sephardic population in Spain, and they're investigating some connection there. Other diseases need more DNA testing. The book by the state historian is from 2005, so there may be further research on these subjects since then. Some of you from Tucson may recognize the name of our state representative, Alma Hernandez, who rediscovered her Jewish roots after being brought up Catholic. She has now been bat mitzvahed and identifies as Jewish. To bring things much closer to home, I heard from Elisa Payars, who many of you know, and she wrote that she has common Sephardic last names on her mother's side and has birth certificates going back 5 generations. Many of her relatives arrived at Hidalgo State for mining jobs and did not observe strong Catholic faith. They moved to Mexico City in the 30s, and at that time they were confused with Sephardic refugees that Cardenas welcomed. He welcomed them to Mexico during Franco's dictatorship. She's currently researching more in Hidalgo and Mexico City and has written to the Lisbon Synagogue. Many of the later waves of immigrants were Ashkenazi. In my own case, my grandparents came from Russia, probably to escape pogroms and military service. Although I must admit, a cousin of my grandfather fought with Panchovia's troops. And he also knew, is it Black Jack Pershing?
Pershing.
Yeah, he knew him by name. I mean, they knew each other. On a lighter note, I found out that Josephine Sarah Marcus, Wyatt Earp's common law wife, was Jewish. And although her family was from Germany and they could come openly as Jews. I thought everyone would appreciate this picture. There's a wonderful book called Jews of the Far West, and I have samples of that. In fact, we have photos of the books. This one, Jews in New Mexico, by Harry Tobias, talks very little about Conversos, but it's a very interesting book about people who are in New Mexico and came as Conversos also. The next one is Pioneer Jews, A New Life in the Far West. That's where that beautiful picture of Wyatt Earp's wife is. There wasn't a whole lot about Conversos there either, because those were many of the Jewish people who came, the Ashkenazi rather, who came and set up many mercantile operations, and you'd recognize the names like Magnin, and there were just a huge number. And I was really surprised by how many. And then To the End of the Earth is the one by Stanley Hordis. It is really, really very, very good research, and there's so many footnotes. You could probably not follow any, you could never follow all of it. It is named To the End of the Earth because there was a woman who was in prison from the Inquisition, and she was there with her mother. And she said, why are they persecuting us? We will have to go to the end of the earth to escape. And that's how he took the name for the book. And there should be one more book. The Coffee Trader is fiction. I have it here. And that's about Jews who went to Amsterdam to escape the Inquisition. And they had to be really careful not to show that they were interacting with the Jewish, the Jews had to show that they were not interacting with inappropriate people. And the Jews had a council called the Ahmad, I think, and they criticized the Jews who were not Jewish enough and were interacting with the local population too much. So there was no winning in this battle. And that's it. So if you have questions.
Also go to England, Great Britain. Did some of the Conversos also go?
They went everywhere,
Yeah.
everywhere.
Repeat the question.
Whether they went to England, right?
Right.
When Anna and I were in Spain, we had to fly out of the town of Girona, outside of Barcelona. And it ends up that was the heart of the Sephardic Jewish population in Spain. And they had a Jewish museum. And I was thinking that I'm Jewish, not Sephardic, but this was a Sephardic town. And they had a Jewish museum, and every name they had, what the people did for a living. Of course, they were all picked out in 1492. And in my personal family history, my mother was born in Ukraine, in what's now Lviv. And so I'm a first generation Jew, but it wasn't the Inquisition, it was
Pogroms.
Europe, right? It was all other time. And the other thing I just wanted to say about talk about the West. In Tombstone, Arizona, there's a great cemetery there, really old. And there's a whole Jewish part of the cemetery in Tombstone, which I thought was quite interesting. That's it.
Thank you very much. Cynthia, here. You want to talk?
I'll just talk with my big voice. I don't need that. Thank you. And so I have two stories to tell. One is my physician in Flagstaff was from New Mexico, and his grandmother said she wants the whole family to come back come back to New Mexico because she has some help. And so family goes back and she said, I want you to know that we're Jewish. We've always observed the Shabbat. We've always circumcised our children. We don't eat pork. And, so he converted and traveled to Israel. And additionally, I read an article, or maybe this was on public radio, about a new rabbi in Albuquerque, New Mexico, knew a woman, very unusual. And one morning, her secretary said there's like 28 old ladies outside that want to talk with you. So they all come in and they say, we want to know that we're Jews and that we have followed the rules. We want to come out. We want to be very interesting.
I do have a story.
Okay.
No, I'm loud.
Okay.
I thought I was.
Adrian Robinson, she's from New Mexico and has a place there. And she had friends there. One day, one of her girlfriends came up and were very excitedly, we're Jewish, because she had known that stuff that they were doing. And they they're Jewish. I thought that was fascinating. It is exciting to discover.
It is funny, but it's heartbreaking, to people that have to hide for century after century.
Yes, I did hear a talk. Stanley Hortis, this historian, was recognized for an honor, and there was a little video of that ceremony. And one of the women said how she felt so torn because she had these two personalities. She felt like she was two people in one body, and couldn't, accept that she couldn't quite identify with who she was. And I do want to just say, there's also a Jewish cemetery in Tombstone. In the cemetery, there's a Jewish area. I don't know if Sarah Mark is buried there, but we were quite surprised to find that.
There's one in Douglas.
Oh, and in Douglas too, that's bigger. That was a bigger Jewish population.
Susan, one of the things that when I came to Álamos, I had never been really around a whole Catholic community, or Catholic country like Mexico is. And I saw all the candles and everything. I thought to myself, oh my God, this comes from Judaism. Because my mother lit Friday night candles. I come from observant home, kosher, the whole 9 yards. And I can see in Catholicism some things that come from Judaism, which is, I find to be interesting too.
I think Jesus Christ, but they.
Yes,
Susan, I wonder if you can hear me. I'm Barbara Kiernan. I'm on the Zoom way up on your screen. Hi, everybody. I can't follow all of your conversation because I don't get a good audio down there. But I wanted to share something that happened to me, and it related to what you said. You said that the Jewish people frequently continued to speak their language. When I studied at the University of Madrid in the 60s, I took a summer afterwards and went around to the Mediterranean area, kind of doing hitchhiking, probably drive my mother crazy. Anyway, I was in Turkey, in Istanbul, and I got sick. And so nobody at the time spoke English. And frankly, I was just looking in the little pharmacies, the little tiny places where they had, the medicines. And like you do when you're in a place where they know, they don't speak your language, you just kind of try for anything. So I said to them, ay, Dios mío, ¿qué hago? And the man in the store, because I said to him in Spanish, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? The man in the store came over to me and said in perfect Spanish, well, dime más, tell me more, what's the matter? But what was really interesting about this was he was speaking a language of the 16th century. I had been in Spain studying literature, and I'd been studying all of these wonderful writers, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, you name it. And they were all using forms that were no longer in use, not even in Spain. So here was this person speaking to me in a language that was hundreds of years old, that they had preserved. And of course, it makes sense, right? They weren't back in Spain, they were living in their own community, but they had preserved this language. Later on, I met other people who were part of the diaspora, and they spoke Ladino, which is a kind of, I don't know, it sounds like Spanish to me, but it isn't. It's that combination of Jewish or Hebrew or whatever the language is, Sephardic. Anyway, so just to share, it was so interesting to me to be back and listening to Spanish from the 17th century, well, 16th century really, and it hasn't changed since. So I hope it's still there. Anyway, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Barbara, for that. Okay, where's
During the nineties, I composed electronically a lot of music for documentaries, and one of the documentaries was Jewish heritage in the American West. And of the number of people who were prominent Jews, like the first governor of Utah and the Wyatt Earp thing, and then there was that colony of people that had an area in Colorado where they moved. You know, there was some sort of a Jewish settlement there, and then it was later that they left because they couldn't make it because they didn't know the territory or how the crops and everything. But in doing I taught in the school in Philadelphia, in suburban Philadelphia, where 50% of the kids were Jewish and said weren't, and so I was familiar with a lot, and so one of the things I tried to do in the documentary, and it's not that audible in the documentary, is to combine Old West folk tunes and Jewish tunes, you know, so you would have maybe an oboe playing one thing and a flute or a piano playing something else. Anyway, it was very informative, and I had no idea there was such an amazing preponderance of Jews in the American West. So it's Montana Public Broadcasting that did it, and I can't find it online, but I have it I've recorded it. I've got it on a thumb drive. So.
Yeah, Cotopaxi is in the Russian Jews settled in Cotopaxi, Colorado.
1880.
Yeah, 1882.
And I think they found they couldn't grow the crops they expected to and things like that. Some of that was in some of these books. I can't tell you how much I had to eliminate in order to make this thing a reasonable. One thing I did find, there was a song called Ocho Candelicas, which is in Ladino. But when I looked it up online, there were these enormous performances with huge orchestras, and you kind of lost the feeling of the song, so I didn't proceed with that.
You know, Edie Gourmet was a Sephardic Jew, and she sang in Spanish a lot, and she spoke Spanish really well, and I guess because of blues, because she never lived in Mexico.
Yes.
Hi, could you explain the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews and then isn't there also conservative Jews in the US?
That's a mixture of several things. The Sephardic Jews were from Iberia, and as I said, they called that area Sepharad, which is where the name comes from. Ashkenazi is the rest of Europe, the German area, Russia. The people came from there. I'm not sure the derivation of that. I didn't look that up. As far as the different types of practices, there is Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and several new offshoots like Reconstructionists. Most were Orthodox to begin with, and then change some of the practices. And for instance, Michael's family, my husband, their family was in Germany, and there was some reform movement there. And my mother-in-law did not work or meet them all together. I think they decided those were old-fashioned practices. And, you know, they just decided they would move the religion forward.
Are there other questions that we have? Okay, first of all, what an exciting presentation, Susan. Let's give her For those of you watching on Zoom, I will try very hard to pull out questions so the volume is high enough so that on the video we can get the question. But what an exciting presentation. Okay, next week we'll be back here and Bob Brink, and you may know him as Catherine Callaghan's brother. Bob Brink will be presenting on the events of the sister cities relationship between Álamos and Scottsdale. So please come back. I know it's best. Thank you very much. Oh, yes.
They are.
Membership dues will go to Carol. She's right here. And so please, and I will send out a receipt from them. Okay, thank you all very much. Oh,
I have copies of the bibliography if anyone would like, and they will be on the Zoom. They will be on the Zoom presentation, and if anyone wants to take a look at the books, I have them here.